David Kenny. I'm the preacher for the Church of Christ in Wadsworth, Ohio on Westgood Avenue. Glad you can join us on the program today. You know, the last series of lessons, we've really been focusing on the importance of the Bible and how do we know it's what it claims to be. The Bible claims to be the Word of God. And we ask, is there any evidence for that? Is there anything to back that up? And we've been talking several lessons about that. And we're right now we're focusing on the accuracy of the historical record. And we talked about, and when we did the lessons on the Old Testament, some examples of that, we also talked that, we would do a lesson on the New Testament. How do we know that the New Testament manuscripts that we have are accurate? Some people say, well, how do you know the Bible is the Word of God? The manuscripts, and they sort of lump them together. They don't realize that the Old Testament is different from the New Testament, and the proofs are different for them. And that's important that we note that when we talk to people. And let's take a look at the argument that we're making in our series that we're doing now. Number one, if it's the case that the Bible is historically accurate and unbiased in every detail, even details that modern history questioned at one time, then the Bible is a historical record beyond peer and an author by one beyond peer, in other words, God. And it is that case, that the Bible is historically accurate, it is unbiased, even revealing details that modern history questioned at one point, and our conclusion is therefore the Bible is a work of a historian beyond peer, and that person is God. Today I want to talk about, as we continue this theme, how do we know that the New Testament we have is the testament of Jesus Christ? How do we know? How do we know that the New Testament we have includes the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, and Jude, and then whoever wrote Hebrews, depending on what viewpoint you take on that? How do we know we have those books? How do we know we have their writings? And you might think, well, that's no big deal. I mean, why talk about something like that? But it is a big deal. I see movies and books and pop singers and all, and they come out time and time again talking about the evils and the misrepresentations, or they accuse the Catholic Church of all kinds of things, like the Da Vinci Code and other, and they just say, well, somebody back in time tampered with this or manipulated that. And the question is that true? Do people ever go back and find out the things that they accuse the Catholic Church of, are they true? And they've been accused of a lot of different things. Now, and I'm not a Catholic, but I recognize there are certain things that people accuse the Catholic Church of doing that they didn't do. One of them is people say, well, how do you know the Catholic Church didn't tamper with the Bible? How do you know they didn't just pick whichever books they wanted to? How do you know you have the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and so on? And they plant seeds of doubt. They try to say, you can't really be sure that you have those writings, and that's what they're trying to do. And hopefully by the time we do this short lesson compared to the amount of material we can present, you'll recognize that you have the New Testament. You don't need another book. You don't need another testament. The New Testament that you have in your Bible is the writings of the first century. Well, how do we know that? And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. But before we do that, I want you to consider the idea of how ancient manuscripts and how rare they are. I put a quote up here from the Christian Courier, which I recommended last time, and I put the phone number up there for you again. This is a different quote, and this talks about the scarcity of ancient manuscripts. And there's really a lesson to be learned from that. And this is what Brother Jackson writes. He says, precious little material from secular writers of the first century has ever survived to this day. The late E.M. Baylock addressed this matter in one of his books. Dr. Baylock taught ancient and biblical history for more than 40 years and was internationally recognized as an authority on the classical writings of antiquity. In discussing the surviving literature of the 50s and 60s of the first century, that's 50 and 60 A.D., the professor wrote, bookends set a foot apart on the desk where I write would enclose the works of those significant years. Now think about that for a moment, what he's saying. We often talk about when a book is on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's on there for a long time. Some people will say, well, that's staying power. Well, you know what? Ancient books would just disappear. They would be put in the dustbin of history and never to be heard of again. It is something to really think about when you start looking at ancient manuscripts, the ones that survive. Why did they survive? And when you talk about the number of them, where they're found, and all these different variables, it is really impressive. And so that's what we're going to look at today. Let's take a look at, for example, first at some ancient manuscripts. And we'll put this chart up here for you to look at. Across the top, I have the author, then the book, if there's one mentioned specifically, the date that it was written by that author, the earliest copy that we have of it, and then what's the gap between the time that they wrote it and the latest copy we have, and then how many ancient copies of it do we have. And take a look at those numbers. For example, the Iliad, Homer's Iliad. Now, nobody doubts that Homer wrote that, but notice that he wrote it around 800 BC. And the earliest copy we have of it is 400 BC. That's 400 years apart. And we have 640 some odd copies of it. You know, that's pretty, you know, you might think, well, okay, so, well, how about Plato? You know, we had to talk about Plato in high school. We had to read some of his writings, the Republic and different things. You know, Plato was 400 BC. The oldest copy we have of his work is 900 AD. That's a spread of 1,300 years, and we have 7 copies, ancient copies, that fall in that classification. Or take a look at this next chart. Here's some other ancient writers. Some of these you may not recognize, but there's some interesting ones there to think about, like Caesar's Gallic Wars. You know, there's 1,000 years difference from the time that he wrote them until the copies that we have. And we only have 10 copies of that. And that's important to note. And sometimes when you're reading things, it helps you to recognize that when people use the term autograph, they're actually talking about the person who wrote the work originally. Their manuscript is called an autograph, so that'd be important to note. And these figures come from a well-known book by Josh McDowell, The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And this sort of gives you an idea of what ancient manuscripts the situation was. And notice that, you know, some of these were hundreds of years apart, the copies that we have versus when they were originally written. And we don't have very many of some of these. Some of them we have, you know, less than 100 of. Now keep that in mind. And let me show you how the Greek New Testament matches up. Let's take a look at this. The Greek New Testament. Now this is, you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, you know, John, Peter, Paul, James, Jude, and the writer of Hebrews. This is the 27 books that we refer to as the New Testament. It is written in Koine Greek. It's a specific format of Greek, a specific type of Greek, written between 50 to 100 AD. We have copies. We have 114 fragments. 114 AD we have fragments of. 200 AD we have books of. 250 most of the New Testament. 325 AD we have the complete New Testament. And then there's a time span, 50 years apart, 100 years, 150, 225 years. None of those are 1,000. And notice the quantity we have. This is just recently, 5,360 some odd copies we have of the Greek New Testament. Now think about back in the chart that we looked at before. You know, we only had a handful of copies, and they were separated by hundreds of years. It's not that way with the Greek New Testament. And you're talking about a document that was written during that same period of time, that original quote that we mentioned, where the guy said that 50 to 60 AD, you could put 2 bookends on my desk and you could fill all the books that are available from that time frame. Now that's something to think about. And let's just take a look at some of these old manuscripts. We don't have time to talk about all of them. There's thousands of them. But let's focus on some of what's called the papyrus manuscripts, papyri manuscripts. And these are some of the oldest. And what I put in there is how they designate them. P52, that number just refers to the kind of material it's made of, papyrus. And then these are the references in the middle is what it includes on that. And notice the dates of them. And that's important to note. Pay close attention to the dates, and that's going to be really important in a minute. Also notice these are found in Egypt. That's important to note. You know, if someone said, well, the Roman, you know, they tampered with it, well, how do you account for these manuscripts that were found recently being found in Egypt? Who tampered with those? Particular of interest is P52, the first one there. That's called the Rylands fragment. It's a part of John. It's actually a 2-sided. And if you take that 2-sided manuscript, that text of John, and you match it to another ancient manuscript, it fits on the page, just like it does on that page. So that tells us that these copies are faithfully copied. And that's important for us to remember. Let's look at some other ones. P46. This has parts of all of Paul's epistles and includes some of the Hebrews. There's some others here, and I just list them down. I don't have time to talk about all of them. But some of these are in pieces. Papyrus was not bound up like a book. A book would be called a codex back then. These are just loose pieces made from a plant that grew in Egypt. That's why these are found in Egypt, because that's where the material was from, probably. And so these are really old manuscripts that we have access to. And the question is, how do these things survive? Let's take another look here at number 189, the next one. This is a uncial. This is the oldest New Testament parchment. And then you have P1, P4, and P5. And there's more. This is just a fraction of the ones that I had time to show you. Of this type, except for the uncial there, 189, but this papyrus type manuscript, papyri, there's 120 of these. And these are among the oldest copies of the Greek New Testament. These are among the oldest. And they're not more than 300 years. So this is important to note, and it's very important. As a matter of fact, recently I just read an article where the person said they have found 7 more of these type of writings. 6 of them they believe to be from the 2nd century. Now we talk about the New Testament, that's a 1st century document. That's written between, it's 50 to 100 AD, 1st century. 2nd century is within 100 years of that, or less. One of them, part of the Gospel of Mark, they think is a part of the 1st century. Now that is incredible. Who knows what else we'll find? These were just recently found. I don't even think these have been published yet. The news story's out about them, but I don't think they've published the actual manuscripts yet. But when you look, you might find that they have done that since the story came out. And that's important to note. And another thing too, we're talking about Greek, the Greek New Testament. They translated the New Testament. They wanted to spread the gospel out. Well, they had to translate it into different languages. And these ancient translations are really old too. And so you could check them. And take a look at the chart here of the New Testament in different languages. And I just listed some of them. The print's pretty small. But at the top there, got like 5,000 some odd Greek manuscripts. But you look at the bottom, the total, all these ancient translations, 19,000 some of them, are outside the Greek. And if you add the Greek ones in, you're talking about 24,000 manuscripts. That is a huge number. Matter of fact, one writer talked about, he pointed out, even beyond this, you have the writings of the early church fathers, and they quoted the New Testament extensively. So much so that one expert who studied their writings said that you could practically reconstruct the Greek New Testament from the early church fathers' writings alone. That's how extensively they quoted it. And then you have other things too. These are just a few of the things that prove that we have the Greek New Testament from an ancient standpoint. A lot of people don't talk about that. They want to deal with conspiracy theories, they want to sell books, make movies, all that. But the facts speak differently. But the question is, are they going to check the facts? Are people going to look at the evidence? So let's go on. Sometimes, one of the things that you hear people say, well, the Bible, is just filled with mistakes. There are thousands of mistakes in here. Well, make sure you understand what they're talking about. They may not know what they're talking about, but make sure you understand what they mean by a mistake. For example, there are textual variants, and I'll put the chart up here for you. And these are different people from different periods of time. There are variants. People are making handmade copies of these books, and you're going to make an error. We know that. So there's a difference between an error and a mistake, a copy and mistake. A copy and mistake is a variant. A lot of times people, when you hear them say the Bible has thousands of errors, what they actually are talking about is variants. And we all know about them. We know where they are, how many of them there are, and you know what? This is no different than any of those other ancient manuscripts. The reason the number is so large is the way that they count them. And we'll show you about that in a second. But what kind of errors are we talking about? We're talking about things like transposing a letter. Maybe you change your word order around. Maybe you misspell something or you omit a word. Sometimes people, they would read the text and people would be copying it by hand as it was being read out loud. Sometimes there would be an error from that because they'd mishear it, things like that. And we know about them. Sometimes, the scribes, they did not want to admit anything. If they were guilty of anything, they would make notations. They would write things like, well, the text is unclear here or something, and they make notations. But they never tried to delete anything. And that's important to note. But we have people today, news media, movies, TV, they'll say, oh, the Bible's been tampered with. Oh, there's thousands of errors. Oh, you can't trust it. Well, you can't, you're going to see by the conclusion of this program, if you can't trust the Bible, you can't trust any ancient manuscript. Because the evidence for the Greek New Testament is far superior than any of these other works that we looked at. And that's the fact. Textual critics, one thing that, they count every error that occurs in every manuscript. And this isn't some kind of conspiracy theory on their part. They have partials of manuscripts. They have certain verses in certain manuscripts, and they have to count them some way. And that's what they call a variant, and this is how they count. And so it's important that we understand the way they count things, because the number is not as large as we may think when we hear the word mistake. And that's important that people understand. I'll give you an example. If we had found 100 ancient manuscripts and we knew the exact same 10 errors occurred in each of them, we might be tempted to say, well, that's just one mistake. Or we might say, well, we have 100 manuscripts that have one mistake, that's 100 mistakes. But see, a textual critic says, no, that's 1,000. See, they count every single error every single time in every individual manuscript. And that's important that you note. And just to give you an illustration, consider this example here on this chart. I had a professor who I dearly admired. I had a term paper, and I had misspelled the word judgment in it. Judgment does not have 2 E's. It has 1 E. And in my paper, I used the term judgment, I don't know, like 10 times. And this teacher took off. He deducted from my grade every single time. If I misspelled judgment wrong 10 times, I lost 10 points, not 1 point. And I told him, I said, look, I misspelled it every single time, the same way. And he said, it don't matter. I'm going to take off every single time. And that really hurt my grade quite a bit. But textual critics sort of operate the same way. They count every incident of the error. So this, for example here, say that I started to copy the Greek New Testament, and I was going to write it down, but let's say I'm using English, and I'm going to use the New King James. And if I looked up how many times the word judgment occurred, and I misspelled it, that would be 79 times. And let's say that, I take that copy and I give it to 5 other copiers, and they look at it and they make their copies of it by hand, and they follow it to the letter. And then let's say each of those 5 copiers give it to 5 more copiers, and they do the same thing. Well, you have my original copy I made where I made the original mistake 79 times. That's 79 variants. And then you go to the next level, those 5 copiers right in the middle, they're going to copy that error every single time. That's another 395 mistakes in their group of manuscripts. And you go to the 3rd level, and their copiers do that. And that's 1,975 errors just in that column. But you have to add them all up. So just because of one misspelling error in one incident, one person, me, misspelling judgment, you reach a total variant count of 2,449. And that's only 31 people, 31 manuscripts. So you can see, hopefully, that these idea of hundreds of thousands of errors, if they find more manuscripts, which we hope we do, we hope we find more of these papyrus manuscripts, codexes. We hope we find thousands of them. You know what happens to the textual variant count? It goes through the roof. Why? Because of the way they count. It's not a conspiracy. You just have to know the way the math works. And so that's important to note, because people hear that and they think, oh, the Bible has all kinds of mistakes in it. Well, it has copying mistakes. And we know what they are. We know by cross-referencing and checking them. We know where it's at. We have ancient manuscripts, several of them, prior to the days of Constantine. Constantine lived 272 to 337 AD. We have manuscripts before him. We have manuscripts prior to Catholicism being declared the only religion of the Roman Empire, 380 AD. We have manuscripts found recently that predates that. We have manuscripts that precede the first universal bishop, pope, the first universal pope of Rome. His name was Boniface III. 606 AD. So this idea, this accusation that the Catholic Church has tampered with our New Testament is false. It's absolutely false. And you ought to be able to see that. When one considers a number of manuscripts, the locations of manuscripts, where they were found, when they were found, there really can be no doubt. We have so many of them to cross-check, to know about. We know we have the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, and Jude, and whoever the writer was of Hebrews. I want to take you to another quote by Wayne Jackson in his excellent book on the Bible on Trial, which I highly recommend that you order. It's a very good book. It answers a lot of these types of questions and more. And it's an outstanding work. In this book, he quotes an expert who studied these things. And he makes a very important observation, this John W. Montgomery. Montgomery makes this statement. He says, to be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity. For no documents of the ancient period are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament. And what he's saying there is, there's no way that the Greek New Testament is not the writings that they claim to be. We have too much evidence. And whatever errors there may have been in copying, we have so much of them that we can weed those out. And if you're going to throw the New Testament out, you have to throw all those other ones. Tacitus, Homer, Caesar, Plato, and there's more evidence by far for the Greek New Testament than there is for those. It's not even close. It's important that you know that. It's important that you're aware of that when you think about that. And be careful when people come to your door and try to tell you, well, this New Testament here, you need a different one. Or you need another one. Because you can't trust the New Testament. That is false. That's incorrect. They may not know some of the things that I've shown you. Hopefully you'll remember these things, and they'll come to your mind, and you'll be able to share it with them. When they say things like, well, the Catholic Church gave us the Bible. No such thing. Or the Council of Nicaea, or the Council of Trent, or what, they're the ones that determine what book. That's false. We know it's false. The evidence is overwhelming that it's false. The question is, are people going to examine the evidence? Are they going to look? Most people don't. Most people don't. They get caught up in these conspiracy theories, and they let these guys take them wherever they want to go, as long as you're paying for the ride. And that's important to remember. You can trust your Greek New Testament. Before we go, let's take one more look at our argument before we close up. If it is the case that the Bible is historically accurate and unbiased in every detail, even details that modern history questioned at one time, then the Bible is a historical record beyond peer and authored by one beyond peer, and that is God. And as we said, you can trust the New Testament you have. Provided you have an accurate translation of it, you can read it with confidence, knowing that you are reading the words in the 21st century, the words of the first century. The Bible has nothing to fear from an honest investigation. We appreciate you watching our program today. Some people have been given wrong directions. They've been told things such as faith only, works only, or grace only would save them. Some have attempted to change the terms along the way. Maybe they put baptism before a person could believe, such as they do with infants. Some become confused when reading the directions because they fail to realize where they are on the map, possibly even thinking they're already saved. As a person is traveling in a car and must follow the road map, so we must follow the proper directions to heaven. Notice the directions on our roadmap include believe, and then repent, then confess, and then immersion, which is baptism, and then a person's added to the church by the Lord. Once added to the church, they serve and worship the Lord faithfully all the days of their life, and that will take them to heaven. Where are you on the roadmap to heaven? If we can assist you with further information, please feel free to contact us.
Scarcely must he Hear